Okay, now next question is, can you tell something about n plus 1 select problem in Hibernate? This is very common question in interview. Interviewer ask these questions for 5 years plus experience people to know their expertise level in Hibernate. So basically, what is n plus 1 select problem? So in when you using the query, so you are using some associated query, like there is a parent table and there is a child table. So this kind of relationship, so when you have one to many or many to many relationship, one to many or many to many relationship, so n plus 1 select operation is due to result of using lazy loading and on demand fetching strategy. Let's talk example. If you have n items in the list and each item from the list has a dependency on a collection of another object, right? So suppose you have a collection, you have a item, you have an object like basket table, and that particular basket table is having list of items from item table on the basis of some item ID, right? So there is a dependency of one collection on another collection, and when you are doing your lazy loading, so in order to find out the highest bid of each item while using the lazy loading strategy, Hibernate has the first fire one query to load all items and then subsequent fire n queries to load a big of each item. So suppose there is a join like that. So there is that one table. In that particular one table, there's a basket table and there one is a list table, I mean item table. So in that particular item table and basket table, there is a kind of mapping, and then that mapping is having that kind of relationship, that is this is a join, suppose. So this join is having like this all some kind of specification is not given to that particular join, like on basis of some kind of ID it is joining in one table, and there is a relationship between the two tables, and that relationship is exactly not so defined. So something is happened, like for particular basket, if there is a null items, and then that particular for null items, if the table is having null item, then this is firing again and again. For single item, there will be kind of cross join situation. So in that particular situation, there is a n plus 1, means there are this firing multiple queries. For one query loading all items, then subsequent n queries loading a big for each item. So there is a n plus 1 problem, and you will having a loop kind of situation. So this will known as n plus 1 select problem. So the Hibernate actually ends up with n plus 1 queries. So there will be this kind of situation. So this is very common question currently asking in the interview. So n plus 1 select problem, what will be the solution of that? So for solution, some strategies needed to be followed for solving n plus 1 select problem. What are that strategies? One is prefetch record in the batches, which help us to reduce the problem of n plus 1 to n by k plus 1, where k refer to the size of each batches. Yani if we have to split that, if that kind of a scenario, we have to split that in the batches, and that particular batches, if there is a n k batch, so n divided by k plus 1, k refer to the size of batch. Sub select the fetching strategy, and as a try avoid disable lazy loading altogether. So avoid or disable lazy loading. So lazy loading should be disabled. So this is n plus 1 problem. So what are the concurrency strategies available in Hibernate? This is very important question. So in Hibernate, concurrencies basically strategies are responsible for storing and retrieving items. Like when you have any transaction where we store or retrieve from cache. ठीक है. So when we are storing and retrieving items from cache, so while enabling the second level cache, it is responsibility of developer to provide what strategy is to be implemented to decide the each persistent class in the collection. So what are the concurrency strategies available in Hibernate? So there are like concurrency strategies. Basically, first we know about the concurrency strategies. What are concurrency strategies? So if suppose we want to store or retrieve something from database, okay, suppose we are storing something we are storing and retrieving from the database, then storing and retrieving items from database, and we are using in cache. So while enabling the secondary level cache, so we will enable the secondary level cache, and it is responsibility of developer to provide the strategy, which strategy should be implemented for each persistent class and collections if we implement the secondary level cache. So followed are the concurrency strategies are used when we are working with cache. So one is transactional. So transactional is used in case of updating data, the most likely stale data, and its prevention is most critical in application. Like so transactional, and then read only, it is used when we don't want to data to be modified. If we want that data to should not be modified, then we will use that read only. Read write, mostly read write we are using in transaction to present the state of the data, stale data, critical importance. So non-strict read write, using this strategy will ensure that there wouldn't be any consistency between the database and cache. The strategy can be used when the data can be modified and state data is not critical concern, right? In between data you want to modify data in between, so data consistency is not critical, then you can use non-strict read write. If data consistency is critical, then you will use read write. If you don't want to write data, you should use read only. And transactional, when you are wanting to update data, most likely use transactional annotation. We are working with cache, secondary level cache. So Spring Boot, how you will implement Spring Boot transactional management in Spring Boot? So there is very easy for managing the transactional annotation, transactional management in Spring Boot using the transactional annotation. So suppose this is a transactional management for employee service, organization service, and health insurance service. So transactional is basically what is a transaction? Transaction is a cross-cutting concern, and it is implemented using AOP in Spring Boot. So if someone asks like how the transaction annotation works, transaction is a cross-cutting concern, and it is implemented using the AOP in Spring Boot. So how? So this kind of like 1 second. So Spring Boot implicitly create a proxy for transaction annotation method. So what Spring Boot does, it is creating a proxy for transactional annotation method. So Spring Boot will create a proxy and for transaction annotation method, so that for such method the proxy will act like a wrapper which take care of creating a transaction. I hope you will understand. So if Spring Boot what implicitly will create a proxy for transaction, and that proxy annotates the method, so that like it should be like that if you proxies of organization service, so creating implicitly by the Spring transaction, so it's before begin transaction and end of the transaction this proxy will work. So it will act like a wrapper for which take care of creating a transaction at the beginning of the method and committing the transaction after method will be executing. So this proxy will take care of that. So what are the different type of transaction? What will do if you not that transactional annotation? You can manually do as well. You can create a transaction object and you can just define a transaction.begin and then a transaction dot end, and before that you can perform your aspiration. In catch block you said a transaction dot rollback. So this kind of things you can do if you are not using at the rate transactional attribute. But if you are using a Spring Boot, then at the transactional annotation, then this is a proxy object, and that proxy will sit between before calling of your method is begin transaction, and after successful completion it will end transaction, and that proxy will be working before and after saving your object. What are the different type of transaction propagations? This is a very important question, very important questions. If you are going for interview, this is transaction propagation. For experienced people, it is very important question. The different type of transaction propagation for Spring Boot are as follows: that are required, supports, non-supported, required new, never, and mandatory. So these are the transaction propagations, like required, supports, not supported, required new, never, and mandatory. How to handle transaction in checked exceptions? So these are the some checked themselves. So JPM transaction manager we can say. So we can importantly notice that JPA itself does not provide any type of declarative transaction management support. When using JPA outside of a dependency injection container, transaction need to be handled programmatically by developer. So you have a UX transaction, entity manager, you get the transaction.begin, business logic, then transaction manager, user transaction, entity manager get transaction, you get the user transaction object, and then user transaction you commit, and if there is any exception there is a rollback. So this way manage transaction makes scope of transaction very clear in the code, but it is several disadvantage. If you define this kind of transaction, then what is the disadvantage? You throw explicitly. So if there is a repetitive error prone, then there is a problem. Error can have very high impact. Errors are hard to debug and decrease the readability of your code. By doing this, the readability of your code will decrease, and the method calls another transaction method, because one transactional method will call another transactional method, and there will be difficult to debug this situation. So what is the solution? Solution is like you can use at the rate transactional annotation, and this annotation transaction get reduced of simplify this. In the business logic you just have annotated at the rate transactional. So this is more convenient and readable code, and currently the recommended way of handle transaction in Spring. So at the rate transactional, many important aspects such as transactional propagations are handled automatically. So whatever transaction propagation I have told you here, these are the transactional propagation methods which I told you, like required, support, not supported, required new, never, and mandatory. These are the transaction propagation methods. These are required, support, not supported, required new, never, and mandatory. So these are handled automatically by transaction manager and use at a transactional annotation. So business logic, that method will have an option to join another transaction. One potential downside is that powerful mechanisms hides what's going on under the hood. So that is a very powerful mechanism, so you will not know, and you will also not need to know the undergoing things, so making it hard to debug things. If things doesn't work, then debugging will be little bit difficult in this level. So now the question comes at the transactional. So what that at the transactional means? So at the transactional is there are two separate concept consider. One is the persistent context, another one is database transactions. So transactional annotation itself defines the scope of single database transaction. The database transaction happens inside the scope of persistence context. So single transaction happen, and then this is the scope of persistence context. The persistent context in the JPA entity manager implemented internally using an Hibernate session. When using Hibernate as a persistent provider, The persistent context is just a synchronizer object that tracks the state of limited set of Java objects and makes sure that the changes on the objects are eventually persisted back to the database. This is very different notation that the one database transactions. One entity manager can be used to across several database transactions, and it's actually often it is. Okay. So that is the at transactional notation. So what will happen if entity manager span multiple database transactions? The most frequent case when application is using open session is view pattern to deal with lazy initialization exception. See the provide blog post pros and okay. We will take care later on this question. I will explain in better way. What defines entity manager versus transactional relations? So this is actually choice of application developer, but most of the frequent way we use JPA entity manager and entity manager as per application transaction pattern. So at the rate persistent context and then entity manager. So here we have entity manager per transaction mode. So this is like entity manager per transaction, and this mode we will use entity manager inside at the rate transactional method. Then the method will run in a single database transaction. So this is at the rate when your method at the rate transactional annotation, and this under the persistent constant you have an entity manager. That means that entity manager per transaction. So what is at the rate persistent context? So at the rate persistent context inject entity manager only once in the container startup time. Given that entity manager are so short lived and they are using multiple prerequisites. So this is the entity manager from as an interface, and which can get injected. Spring Bean is not the entity manager itself as a context aware proxy. So usually concrete classes use the proxy, so shared entity manager invoice handler, and this can be confirmed from the help of debugger. So entity manager, I can explain it. Let give it I. So persistent concept proxy implement the entity manager. So it is not only component needed making the declarative transaction management work. Actually, three separate components are needed. Entity manager itself, and the transactional aspect, and the transactional manager. One is entity manager itself, another one is transactional aspect, another one is transaction manager. So what will happen? What is transactional aspect? So transactional aspect is around aspect and get called before and after the annotation business method. The concrete class of implementing the aspect is transactional interceptor. Transaction aspect has two main responsibilities. Before moment, aspect provides a hook point to determining if the business method about to be called should run in the scope or ongoing database transaction, or if the new separate transaction should be started. So this is the transactional interceptor. That transactional aspect have this aspect is around aspect and is called before and after the annotation business method. Like so, implementing the aspect is transaction interceptor. That interceptor, what it does before moment, what it will do, aspect provides a hook point for determining the business method is about to run in scope of ongoing database transaction, or there should be a new transaction. And after moment, aspect need to decide if transaction should be committed, rollback, or left running, right? So this is a transactional aspect. So we in every transactional annotation there are three things we should remember. One is entity manager, which is proxy itself. Another one is transaction aspect. Another one is transaction manager. So transaction aspect is very important. Transaction aspect is a round aspect and that get called before and after the annotated business method. Right, the concrete class for implementing the aspect is transactional interceptor. This is the transactional interceptor, transaction interceptor. This is the concrete class. Transaction interceptor has two main responsibility. One is before, another one is after. If you know about the aspect, then you will understand this. If you don't know about the aspect, so I will recommend you to read related by Spring AOP, or I will also discuss the Spring AOP in later videos. And in Spring AOP we have this kind of annotation like before, after, and we have concerns and point cuts like that. So we will discuss. But if you know the Spring AOP, you will know these all terms like transactional aspect has two main, like before moment, after moment. So aspect provides a hook point. That hook point will determine the business method about the call should run in scope of annotation, whether the scope is new transaction or it is an ongoing transaction. So it will be it will before moment aspect provides a hook point for determining. It will provide a hook that will determine this is ongoing call or this is new transaction. And after moment of aspect need to decide if the transaction should be committed, rollback or running. So after moment will be deciding. So transactional aspect is very important, and after moment and before moment determining the hook point of business method, that should be called ongoing transaction or it is a new transaction, and after moment will be transaction should be committed, rollback or running. Now there is a transactional manager. In that particular transaction manager needs to provide an answer of these two questions. Should a new entry manager will be created, entity manager, or should a new database transaction will be started? Or if new entity manager will be created or new database transaction will be started. Then need to be decided at the moment of transactional aspect before logic called. So transactional manager will decide based on this transaction aspect. So transaction aspect will be before moment it will deciding point will be hook point for determining business method, whether it will be new transaction or it will be ongoing transaction. So entity manager will be created so transaction manager need to provide an answer of the two questions. Should a new entity manager created or new database transaction should be started? So need to be determined in the before logic is called. Transaction manager will decide based on the fact on one transaction is already ongoing or not. So first of all it will decided by the aspect before method whether this transaction is ongoing or not. The propagation attribute of the transactional method, for example, is requires new or requires underscore new. Always start a new transaction. In the transactional manager decide to create a new transaction, then it will create a new entity manager, bind that entity manager to the current thread. It will create a new entity manager, bind that entity manager to the current thread, and grab the connection from DB connection pool and bind the connection to the current thread. DB connection pool, it will pull the connection from DB connection pool and then bind that connection to that particular current thread. The entity manager and the connection are both bound to the current thread using the thread local variable. So entity manager and connections both are bound using the thread local variable. So they are stored in a thread while transaction is running, and it's up to the transaction manager to clean up if there is no longer needed. As part of a program need to current entity manager or connection can be retrieved from this thread. One program component that does exactly is entity manager proxy. So now discuss entity manager proxy. Entity manager proxy is the last piece of puzzle. So entity manager dot persist. This will call this not working entity manager directly. Instead of business method, call proxy and retrieve the current entity manager from the thread, and then transaction manager put that transitional mechanism. Like putting it all together, if you want to learn, then now what we have learned is @ configuration. This is the @ configuration annotation. So these components need to make a transactional annotation work correctly. We start by defining the entity manager factory, and that will allow the injection of entity manager proxies, right? the persistent context annotation. So how it will be, like at the rate configuration annotation, we have auto add data source. Now at the rate bean name is equal to entity manager factory. So local container entity manager factory bean reference like this, and we have something like this, we have new JP adapter, something like this we have written. Now next is configure the transaction manager to apply the transactional aspect. So we have at the rate configuration, at the rate enable transactional management. So at the rate enable transaction manager, at the rate transaction annotation will be active. Now auto wire entity manager factory and auto wire the data source. So it will be transaction management and it will return that transaction manager. Right, now we have covered most of the tough question, and then we have some basic question that is asking like what is JPA. So JPA is defined mapping of Java object to a database table. That procedure to map a Java object to a row in a database table is defined as JPA. Java Persistence API provides a lot of useful annotation using which relationship between the classes and tables are defined. What is Hibernate? Once a mapping is done, Hibernate a JPA implementation. Hibernate is a JPA implementation which help us to create query under the hood. Form.xml file, you all know group ID, artifact ID, packaging, version, request param annotation, what it do. What is the JDBC template? So JDBC template, why we need that? This can be useful using query method in JDBC template. There are two interface, that is a result set executor and row mapper. So result set executor, it define only one method, that is extract data, that accept the result set instance as a parameter and return the list syntax. So that is, there is extract data method that is will accept as a result set as a parameter and return a list, right? Return a list. So that is basically result set executor, that will be having a execute data, extract data, and that is having under a result set parameter. And there is a row mapper, this enhance the version of result set extractor that serves a lot of code. It allow map row of that relation which instance of user defined classes and result set internally used. So JDBC template is basically used when we have a custom queries. So we have a custom queries, so we don't go to the relational mapping, then we can use simply JDBC template. So what result set executor and row mapper. Row mapper will give the mapping with the each row with the database. How does Hibernate ORM work? Object relationship mapping is a phenomenon of mapping application domain model object to the relational database tables and vice versa, right? Hibernate is the most commonly used ORM framework. Hibernate validator framework. So data validation is very crucial part in any application. We can find out the data validation is UI layer, server side layer, and before processing data into database. So validation is also a cross-cutting concern task. So good practice, we should try to keep a part of business logic. JSR 303 and JSR 349 provide the specification for bean validation by using this annotation. So JSR 303 and JSR 349, these are the specification for bean validation, and framework provides the reference for implementation of JSR 303 and JSR 349 specification. So Hibernate framework provides the reference implementation for JSR 303 and JSR 349 specifications. So Hibernate template class. So we have done with our Hibernate question and answer series. So please comment and ask us in the chat box if you need any another help. That's it from my side. Thanks for watching us.